The wind howled as Jenna drove down the desolate road. Her hands clutched the steering wheel, her knuckles paled from the tension. The trees lining the path loomed like dark sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of her car tires on the cracked asphalt and the occasional crackle of the fading radio. Jenna had always been cautious, even paranoid at times. Her friends teased her for it. "You're afraid of everything," they'd say, laughing. But she didn't care. Caution had kept her alive in a world that seemed increasingly cruel. Tonight, though, caution wasn't enough. Her car stuttered and lurched, the engine coughing as the headlights flickered. Panic clawed at Jenna's chest. She was miles from civilization, stranded on a stretch of road where cell service was as dead as the air around her. She pulled to the side and stepped out, the cold biting through her jacket. The woods were eerily silent, the usual hum of insects and rustling leaves conspicuously absent. She opened the hood and peered into the engine, though she had no idea what she was looking at. A faint rustling sound came from the trees. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She slammed the hood shut and turned back to the car, but froze. Her breath caught in her throat. In the condensation on her rear window, a single word was scrawled. Her heart pounded as she scrambled into the driver's seat, locking the doors. The keys trembled in her hand as she turned the ignition. The car sputtered but refused to start. Tears blurred her vision as she pounded the steering wheel in frustration. The rustling grew louder. This time, it came from all directions. Jenna turned toward the woods, and that's when she saw them. Shadowy figures, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the trees, their movements unnaturally jerky. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness, fixating on her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. She grabbed her phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen displayed only static. The figures stepped closer, their twisted forms becoming clearer. Their limbs were too long, their faces featureless except for those eyes, bright, cold, and empty. Jenna did the only thing she could think of. She ran. The forest was a labyrinth of darkness, the trees forming an oppressive canopy overhead. Jenna's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled over roots and underbrush. The figures pursued her, their movements eerily silent despite their speed. She tripped, falling hard onto the damp earth. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself to keep going. The figures were closer now. She could feel their presence like a cold hand on her spine. She burst into a clearing and froze. In the center stood an old cabin, its windows shattered and its roof sagging. It looked abandoned, but it was her only hope. Jenna limped to the cabin, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The interior was worse than she'd imagined. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and broken furniture was scattered across the floor. She grabbed a rusted knife from the kitchen counter, gripping it tightly as she backed into a corner. Her eyes darted to the windows, expecting the figures to appear at any moment. Minutes passed. Then hours. The forest outside remained still, but Jenna knew they were out there, waiting. As dawn approached, Jenna began to hope. Maybe they were gone. Maybe she'd survived. She stood, wincing at the pain in her ankle, and moved toward the window. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the clearing. But the forest wasn't empty. They were still there, standing motionless at the edge of the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. A sound behind her made her spin around. The knife slipped from her fingers as she stared in horror. One of the figures was inside the cabin, its lanky form crouched in the corner. Its head tilted unnaturally, and for the first time, it spoke. "You can't run," it hissed, its voice a guttural rasp. Jenna screamed as the figure lunged toward her, its cold, bony hands wrapping around her throat. When the police found the cabin days later, it was empty. No sign of Jenna, no sign of struggle. Just an abandoned car on a forgotten road and a single word scratched into the cabin wall. To this day, locals warn travelers to avoid that stretch of road at night. They say the forest watches, waiting for the next person to stumble into its trap. And once it has you, there's no escape. The night was unnaturally still when Mark stumbled upon the forgotten cemetery. He was a drifter, passing through the small, decaying town of Willow Hollow. Locals avoided him, their weathered faces clouded with suspicion. But Mark didn't care. He liked the quiet, the solitude. Until that night. The cemetery wasn't on any map, hidden deep within the gnarled woods that bordered the town. A jagged iron gate hung loosely on its rusted hinges, creaking faintly as he pushed it open. Thick fog slithered across the ground, pooling around gravestones so old their inscriptions had eroded into unreadable whispers. Mark wasn't sure why he was drawn there. Perhaps it was the faint hum that pulsed in the air, a vibration just beneath the surface of sound. Or perhaps it was the way the woods seemed to funnel him toward the gate, the trees bending like skeletal hands, pointing the way. He passed rows of graves, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The names were unfamiliar, the dates impossibly ancient. Something about the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. It smelled of damp earth and decay, but beneath it was another scent, metallic, sharp, and sour. As he walked deeper into the cemetery, he noticed the ground beneath his feet was soft, almost pliable, like it had been recently disturbed. He stopped in front of a mausoleum, its stone facade cracked and moss-covered. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness within impenetrable. A voice, soft, pleading, called out from inside. "Help me." Mark froze. The voice was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably human. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. The air turned colder, each breath escaping his lips in pale white clouds. The interior smelled of mildew and rot. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing. The only answer was the sound of something scraping against stone. He moved deeper into the mausoleum, his flashlight flickering as if struggling to stay alive. In the corner, he saw it, a coffin. Its lid was slightly open, revealing the edge of something pale and unmoving. Mark approached cautiously, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. When he was close enough, he reached out and pushed the lid open. What lay inside was no corpse. A woman, her skin ashen and stretched taut over sharp bones, stared up at him with milky, unseeing eyes. Her lips were sewn shut with thick black thread, but her hands clawed desperately at the sides of the coffin. Before Mark could react, the mausoleum door slammed shut behind him. The temperature plummeted further, frost creeping up the walls. He spun around, his flashlight revealing rows of shadowy figures standing in the corners of the room. They were human-shaped, but wrong. Their faces were blank slates of flesh, their limbs too long and twisted at unnatural angles. The woman in the coffin let out a muffled scream, the thread tearing her lips as she writhed. Mark stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. Darkness consumed the room, but he could still feel them, those faceless things closing in on him. A hand, cold and clammy, grasped his ankle, pulling him to the ground. He screamed, kicking wildly, but it was useless. The figures dragged him toward the coffin, their grip unyielding. As they forced him inside, he felt the soil closing over him, suffocating and heavy. The last thing he saw was the woman's face, her lips now free, whispering a single word. "Stay." The world went silent as the grave sealed itself. The next morning, the cemetery was quiet again. No sign of Mark, no sign of disturbance. Just the ancient graves, the forgotten mausoleum, and the faint hum of something beneath the earth, waiting. Mark's consciousness flickered like a dying flame. Darkness pressed against him from every direction, and the weight of the soil above felt like an eternity of restraint. Panic surged in his chest as he tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. He clawed at the coffin's lid, his nails splitting against the splintered wood. Then, he felt it, a slow, deliberate movement beside him. Something shifted in the confined space, pressing against his side. He wasn't alone. A raspy breath scraped against his ear, and a cold, skeletal hand grazed his arm. Mark froze, terror gripping him tighter than the dirt around him. The thing in the coffin whispered, its voice fractured and broken. "Don't fight. It's worse if you fight." Mark thrashed, adrenaline giving him the strength to push against the lid. To his shock, the wood splintered, and he felt the rush of cool air as the soil above parted. He clawed his way out, gasping as he emerged into the cemetery. But it wasn't the same. The sky above was a swirling vortex of gray and black, like storm clouds frozen mid-twist. The gravestones stood taller, their edges sharper, and the air buzzed with an unnatural energy. Shadows moved between the tombstones, too fast to catch, but heavy enough to feel. Mark stumbled to his feet, dirt falling from his clothes as he staggered toward the gate. His flashlight was gone, but a faint, sickly green glow emanated from the ground, illuminating his path. As he approached the gate, the iron bars began to twist and bend, forming an impenetrable wall. The cemetery wasn't letting him leave. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered from behind him. Mark spun around. The woman from the coffin stood a few feet away, her tattered dress billowing in a wind that didn't exist. Her lips were now smooth, the stitches gone, but her milky eyes bore into him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "What is this place?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "It's where the lost come to suffer," she replied. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was an undercurrent of something far darker. "You disturbed the dead, and now you belong to them." Mark shook his head, backing away. "No, this isn't real. This is just a nightmare." The woman smiled, a grotesque, unnatural stretch of her lips. "It's real. And it's endless." The ground beneath Mark's feet began to shift, the soil churning as if alive. Hands, skeletal, rotted, and pale, burst from the earth, clawing at his legs and pulling him down. He screamed, kicking and fighting, but there were too many. The woman watched impassively as the hands dragged him back into the ground. As the dirt closed over him, her voice echoed in his mind. "They'll keep you alive, for the torture." Mark awoke in darkness again, his body rigid and bound. But this time, he wasn't in a coffin. He was in a chamber, its walls lined with bones and roots. Dim, flickering flames cast shadows that danced like malevolent spirits. A table stood in the center of the room, and atop it lay instruments of pain, rusted knives, hooks, and tools whose purposes were too horrifying to imagine. Surrounding the table were the figures from the mausoleum, their blank faces tilted toward him as if in anticipation. One of them stepped forward, holding a rusted blade. Though it had no mouth, Mark could hear its voice in his mind, a guttural rasp that dripped with malice. "You disturbed our rest. Now, you will know what it is to suffer." They began their work slowly, methodically, ensuring Mark felt every moment of agony. Time lost all meaning as the creatures carved into his flesh, whispered curses into his ears, and filled his veins with cold, writhing shadows. But Mark never died. His body healed just enough to endure the next wave of torment. He screamed until his voice gave out. He begged until his mind splintered. And yet, the torture continued. Years passed, or perhaps only hours. Mark had lost all sense of self, his existence reduced to an unending cycle of pain and fear. But one day, the creatures stopped. They stepped back, their heads tilting as if listening to something unseen. The woman appeared again, her pale form glowing faintly in the dim chamber. "You've endured well," she said, her tone almost admiring. "Most break far sooner." Mark's cracked lips moved, but no sound came out. "You want it to end," she continued. "I can give you that mercy, for a price." Desperation filled his hollowed eyes as he nodded. "You will take my place," she said. "You will watch over the graves, ensure no one disturbs the dead. Fail, and your torture will begin anew." Without waiting for his response, she touched his forehead. A searing pain shot through his skull, and everything went white. When Mark awoke, he was standing at the gate of the cemetery, his body whole again, but no longer his own. His reflection in a puddle revealed a blank, featureless face. The cemetery was quiet once more, the graves undisturbed. But Mark knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He was the guardian now, and he would ensure that anyone who entered never left.